The alien invasion of New York left a lasting scar on Captain America. Night after night, Steve Rogers was tormented by visions of destruction, the faces of those he couldn't save haunting him like specters. It was unbearable, and no amount of strategizing or shield throwing could quiet his guilt. For the first time in decades, Steve felt unmoored, his confidence shaken. After a long conversation with Tony Stark, he decided to leave the city behind, hoping to find solace in a quiet corner of the world. Steve chose Crystal Lake, a serene retreat tucked away in the forests of New Jersey. With its crystal clear waters and peaceful surroundings, it seemed the perfect place to heal. He traded his shield for simple flannel shirts, his Avengers headquarters for a small cabin on the lake's edge. For the first time in years, he tried to live simply, just as Steve Rogers, not Captain America. The town near Crystal Lake welcomed him with open arms. They didn't pry, didn't ask for autographs or war stories. They treated him like one of their own. He found himself chopping firewood for the elderly, helping repair a crumbling dock, and sharing coffee with locals at the diner. Life was simple, even pleasant. But summer brought with it an influx of campers to Crystal Lake, and the whispers of old legends began to surface. It was on a warm Thursday afternoon that Jack and his friends Alice, Michael, and Mary arrived at Crystal Lake. They were college students on break, their car brimming with tents, sleeping bags, and enough beer to last them the weekend. They laughed as they pitched their tents, teased each other as they struggled to start a campfire, and sang along to old songs as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was idyllic until Friday came. Jack, the de facto leader of the group, decided to go for a solo walk in the woods after dinner. The forest was alive with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jack felt invincible, invulnerable even, as he wandered deeper into the woods. But then he heard a sharp crack behind him, like a branch snapping underfoot. He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. "It's just an animal," he muttered to himself. But the feeling of being watched crept over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He quickened his pace, but the sound came again, closer this time. He spun around, shining his phone's flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, a hulking figure, clad in tattered clothing, a hockey mask obscuring its face. Jack laughed nervously. "Good one, guys. You got me," he called out, assuming it was one of his friends playing a prank. But the figure didn't move, didn't laugh. Instead, it raised an ancient bow, knocking an arrow with eerie precision. Before Jack could process what was happening, the arrow flew, grazing the side of his head and embedding itself in a tree. Jack screamed and bolted. He ran faster than he thought possible, crashing through the undergrowth, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He dove behind a tree, clutching his phone, trying to stifle the sound of his breathing. For a moment, it was quiet. He dared to peek out, scanning the woods for the figure. Nothing. Relief washed over him as he turned to head back to camp. But when he rounded the tree, the figure was there, blocking his path. A glint of metal caught his eye, a machete raised high. Jack didn't even have time to scream before it came down. Back at the campsite, the others heard Jack's distant scream. Alice was the first to react. "Stay here," she shouted, grabbing a flashlight and sprinting toward the sound. Michael and Mary hesitated, but when Alice didn't return, Michael decided to follow. Mary stayed behind, trembling as the minutes dragged on. Alice ran as fast as she could, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly. She called Jack's name, her voice cracking with fear. When she reached a clearing, she stopped dead. Jack's lifeless body lay sprawled on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. "Oh my God," she whispered, backing away. That's when she heard a low, deliberate crunch of leaves behind her. She turned, and there he was, the hulking figure, his machete slick with blood. She didn't even have time to scream. By dawn, all 4 campers were dead. Their bodies were discovered by hikers, and panic rippled through the town. Steve Rogers heard the news over breakfast at the diner. The waitress, pale and shaking, handed him the paper. 4 kids. Slaughtered up by Crystal Lake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They say it's the legend of Jason Voorhees come to life. Steve's jaw tightened. He had heard the stories of vengeful spirit haunting the lake, punishing anyone who dared tread too close. But Steve wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. What he did believe in was protecting innocent lives. Donning his old uniform for the first time since leaving New York, Captain America made his way to the scene. The sight of the blood-soaked ground and the eerie stillness of the forest set his nerves on edge. He crouched down, examining the slash marks on the trees, the deep gouges in the earth. Then he heard a soft rustle, almost imperceptible. He stood, shield at the ready, scanning the tree line. For a moment, all was silent. Then the figure emerged from the shadows. Jason Voorhees. For the first time in a long time, Steve Rogers felt fear, but he stood his ground, gripping his shield tightly. "Let's see what you've got," he muttered, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The forest grew deathly quiet as the two figures faced off, the calm before the storm. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the rustling of leaves under Captain America's boots as he approached the clearing. The air was heavy with dread, the kind that settles deep in the bones and refuses to leave. He gripped his shield tightly, its metallic surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. Across from him stood Jason Voorhees, a towering figure that seemed more monster than man. The hockey mask obscured his face, but the raw malice emanating from him was palpable. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Steve Rogers wasn't one to let fear control him, but Jason's presence felt unnatural, like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the devastation was moments away. Jason moved first. With surprising speed, he raised his blood-stained machete and charged. Steve barely had time to react, lifting his shield just as the blade came down. The clang of metal against metal reverberated through the forest, but Jason didn't stop. He struck again, the force of the blow sending Steve stumbling backward. His boot caught on a root, and he fell hard onto his back. Jason loomed over him, machete raised high. Steve acted on instinct, hurling his shield with all his might. It struck Jason square in the chest, the impact enough to knock the hulking figure to the ground. Steve scrambled to his feet, retrieving the shield as it ricocheted back to him. Without hesitation, he began pounding Jason with a flurry of blows, each strike resonating with the force of his frustration and determination. But Jason barely flinched, his body absorbing the hits like a force of nature impervious to pain. Before Steve could adjust his strategy, Jason's massive boot shot out, catching him in the chest. The blow sent Steve flying into a tree, his head cracking against the bark. The world spun, and darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before blacking out was Jason standing over him, machete gleaming in the moonlight. When Steve woke, the forest was still and Jason was gone. A throbbing pain radiated from the back of his head, but he forced himself upright, gripping his shield for support. He scanned the area for any sign of his attacker, blood, footprints, anything, but the forest betrayed no trace of Jason Voorhees. Frustrated and disoriented, Steve made his way back to town. The streets were already abuzz with panic as news of the murders spread like wildfire. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, their voices a cacophony of fear and speculation. When Steve appeared, battered and visibly shaken, the questions came in a deluge. Is it true? Is Jason back? Are we safe? What are we supposed to do? Steve raised a hand, silencing the crowd. His voice was steady, though his heart was heavy. Jason Voorhees is real. I faced him tonight. This town isn't safe, not while he's out there. Stay indoors after dark. Avoid the woods. Protect your families. The townspeople erupted into chaos, some shouting in fear, others pleading for more answers. The sheriff tried in vain to calm them, but their terror was too far gone. Some spoke of packing up and leaving town altogether. Steve pushed through the crowd, heading back to his cabin. He needed time to think, to plan. Sitting alone in his small wooden retreat, he stared out at the lake, its surface placid and deceptively serene. Failure gnawed at him. He was Captain America. He was supposed to protect the innocent, to stand as a shield against evil. Yet here he was, outmatched by a ghost story made flesh. He spent the next day methodically piecing together every scrap of information he could about Jason Voorhees. He spoke to locals who had lived in the town for decades, including those who claimed to have encountered Jason and survived. The stories were grim and chilling. A young boy who had drowned in the lake, a vengeful spirit haunting the woods, and a seemingly indestructible killer who returned every Friday the 13th to claim new victims. Through these conversations, Steve began to piece together a profile of his enemy. Jason was relentless, unfeeling, and nearly impossible to kill, but he wasn't invincible. Stories hinted at moments of hesitation, a vulnerability tied to his tragic past. His mother, Pamela Voorhees, was the catalyst for his murderous spree. Appealing to that fractured psyche might give Steve the edge he needed. Friday arrived with an oppressive weight. The town was a ghost of its usual self, shops shuttered and streets empty. The forest, once teeming with life, felt abandoned, as if even the animals had fled. Steve prepared meticulously, donning his uniform and ensuring his shield was in perfect condition. This time, he wasn't going in blind. He had a plan, and he was determined to see it through. Night fell, and the forest came alive with its usual symphony of sounds. But Steve could sense the change, the unnatural stillness that marked Jason's presence. He ventured into the woods, his every sense on high alert. The darkness was suffocating, the trees towering like sentinels around him. He didn't have to wait long. Jason emerged from the shadows, his machete gleaming in the moonlight. They faced each other once again, predator and protector. This time, Steve was ready. Jason charged, and Steve met him head-on, using his shield to deflect the brutal swings of the machete. The battle was ferocious, each blow resounding like thunder in the still night. Steve's strategy was different now. He aimed to outmaneuver Jason, to exploit his slower, more methodical movements. He ducked, dodged, and struck when opportunities arose, aiming for weak points he had identified. But Jason was relentless, and the fight stretched on, each moment fraught with tension. As Steve lured Jason closer to the lake, he unveiled the final part of his plan. Using a makeshift trap he had prepared earlier, he managed to knock Jason off balance, sending the killer tumbling into the water. For a moment, it seemed over. Jason sank beneath the surface, the lake swallowing him whole. But Steve knew better than to assume victory. He stood at the water's edge, shield raised, waiting for the inevitable. Jason emerged, his mask cracked, his machete gone, but his rage undiminished. The fight wasn't over, not yet. And Steve Rogers, bruised and battered, steeled himself for one final battle against the unstoppable force that was Jason Voorhees.